Honestly, who let the civilian IT support wander onto the command deck during a Tier 1 readiness drill? Someone get her a coffee in a spot behind the glass, for goodness sake. We have professionals at work here. The crowd of assembled officers, a sea of decorated navy blue and crisp white, rippled with a wave of sycophantic, nervous laughter. The voice belonged to Rear Admiral Marcus Thorne, a man whose chest was a constellation of past glories and whose presence filled the Fleet Command Operations Center with an almost physical pressure. His words, sharp and dismissive, were aimed like a directed energy weapon at the single point of stillness in the room. A lone figure in a plain, unadorned gray flight suit, seated at a secondary tactical console slightly offset from the main holographic display. She was Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Hayes, though no one here knew her rank, her name, or her purpose. They saw only what the Admiral's assumptions had painted for them. A woman too young, too quiet, and too unassuming to possibly belong in the heart of the storm. She didn't flinch. She didn't look up. Her posture remained a study in placid efficiency, a perfect straight-backed line of focus. Her hands rested on the keyboard of her console, fingers slightly arched, not in anticipation, but in a state of serene readiness, like a concert pianist waiting for the conductor's signal. The laughter died down into an awkward, shuffling silence, the echo of the Admiral's arrogance hanging in the climate-controlled air. The only sound was the low, omnipresent hum of the servers that were the building's lifeblood, a digital heartbeat for the fleet itself. Thorne, satisfied with his assertion of dominance, turned his attention back to the primary holographic tank, a swirling galaxy of blue and red icons representing friendly and simulated enemy forces. But from a shadowed back of the observation deck, standing behind the polarized glass meant for visiting dignitaries, Fleet Admiral Jonathan Cole saw something else. He didn't see an out-of-place technician. He saw the posture. He saw the deliberate, almost meditative calm. He saw the way her focus wasn't on the people in the room, but on the data flowing across her screen, a river of pure information that she seemed to be reading with an almost preternatural fluency. It was a stillness he hadn't seen in 30 years. Not since a legendary submarine commander he once knew had calmly navigated a crippled boat through a minefield using nothing but sonar returns and a gut feeling. It was the calm of absolute, unshakable competence. A competence so profound it required no announcement, no validation, and no uniform to prove its existence. The Admiral's insult was a stone thrown into a deep, silent lake. There was no splash, no reaction, only the quiet certainty that something immense and powerful lay undisturbed in the depths below. If you believe that true strength is found not in the volume of the voice, but in the precision of the action, type competence in the comments below. For the professionals in the room, the simulation was about to begin. For Evelyn Hayes, the work had already started. The quiet hum of the servers seemed to pitch slightly higher, a subtle shift in the room's energy that only she seemed to notice. The data stream on her private console began to accelerate, the lines of code and tactical readouts blurring into a waterfall of light. To anyone else, it would have been an incomprehensible flood of information, a chaotic mess of symbols and numbers. To her, it was a language as clear and concise as a spoken word. Rear Admiral Thorne clapped his hands together, a sound like a gunshot in the tense atmosphere. All right, people, let's look alive. Initiation sequence in 5, 4, 3. He was a man who thrived on ceremony, on the performance of command. His voice was his primary tool, a bludgeon he used to shape the world to his will. He believed leadership was about projection, about radiating an aura of indomitable confidence that would inspire those below him. He mistook silence for weakness and stillness for inaction. It was the foundational error of his otherwise storied career, a blind spot he was about to have surgically and painfully exposed. The great holographic tank in the center of the room flickered, the peaceful blue icons of the carrier strike group suddenly surrounded by a swarm of angry red markers that bloomed into existence from all directions, from every domain. They appeared from beneath the waves, from the upper atmosphere, and from the digital ether itself. It wasn't just an attack. It was an annihilation event. The room gasped. Seasoned tactical officers who had spent their entire careers wargaming scenarios like this felt a cold knot of dread tighten in their stomachs. The scale was impossible. The coordination was perfect. Hypersonic missiles streaked in from orbital platforms, their trajectories too fast to track, too numerous to intercept. Ghostly signatures of enemy submarines materialized inside the fleet's defensive perimeter, having somehow bypassed the multi-layered sonar nets. Simultaneously, a brutal cyber warfare assault began, and the command center's own systems started to flicker. Screens went blank. Communications channels filled with static. Red warning lights began to flash on consoles around the room, each one a beacon of failure. It was a digital Pearl Harbor, a perfectly executed, multi-domain ambush designed to be utterly unwinnable. Thorne's face, usually a mask of stern control, was now pale. The performance was over. This was real, or as real as a simulation could be. He began barking orders, his voice retaining its volume, but losing its core of authority. Engage CIWS point defense. Launch all fighters. I want a full spread of anti-submarine torpedoes now. Reroute comms through the secondary satellite array. The commands were standard, textbook responses to individual threats. But this wasn't a series of individual threats. It was a single, interconnected organism of destruction, and Thorne was trying to fight a hydra by cutting off one head at a time, only for two more to grow in its place. His orders were being fed into a system that was rapidly degrading, a system that was actively fighting back against its users. The officers at the consoles typed furiously, their faces grim. Negative, Admiral. CIWS can't lock on. The missile signatures are masked. Sir, our fighters are blind. Their guidance systems are compromised. Comms are down across the board. Admiral, we're cut off. The carefully constructed edifice of professional military order was crumbling into chaos. Panic began to creep into the room, a poisonous vapor spreading from one station to the next. The red icons on the holographic map were closing in, a tidal wave of crimson about to crash over the last vestiges of blue. The invincible fleet was being dismembered, piece by piece, on a silent, glowing display. Thorne stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists, his mind unable to process the sheer speed and totality of the collapse. His entire career, his entire understanding of naval warfare, was being rendered obsolete in a matter of seconds. And through it all, the quiet woman in the gray flight suit had not moved. She had not spoken. She had simply watched, her eyes tracking the flow of data on her own isolated console. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of pure, analytical calm. It was the calm before her own personal storm. The orchestrated chaos of the simulation was a symphony of despair, and the conductor was about to be a woman no one in the room even knew was there. Her hands, which had been resting patiently above her keyboard, finally descended. They did not type, they danced. There was no frantic hammering of keys, no wasted motion. It was a display of pure, unadulterated virtuosity, a seamless fusion of human intellect and machine logic. Her fingers moved with a liquid grace, a blur of controlled energy that seemed impossibly fast, yet utterly precise. Each keystroke was a decision. Each line of code was a command. While the main command staff was fighting the enemy, Evelyn Hayes was fighting the system itself. She wasn't just inputting orders. She was fundamentally rewriting the rules of the engagement in real time. The first sign that something had changed was subtle. A junior communications officer, his face slick with sweat, blinked in confusion at his screen. Sir, I have a signal. It's not standard comms. It's a data stream, a direct link between the Aegis cruisers and the E-2 Hawkeyes. Bypassing the central network entirely, Thorne barely heard him, still reeling from the overwhelming tactical failure. But on the main holographic display, a thin, green line suddenly connected two of the beleaguered blue icons. It was a lifeline, a new nervous system being created from scratch in the midst of total collapse. Hayes had diagnosed the cyber attack, found a flaw in its architecture, and exploited it, creating a closed, hardened network for the fleet's most critical assets in less than 3 seconds. It was a move of such breathtaking technical genius that the cyber warfare specialists watching from their own consoles could only stare, their mouths agape. They had spent months training to defend against attacks like this. She had dismantled one and built a new network in the time it took them to identify the threat vector. Then her focus shifted. Her left hand continued to manage the new micronetwork she had created, while her right began to orchestrate the defense. The hypersonic missiles were still inbound, an unstoppable swarm. The ship-based defenses were useless. But Hayes wasn't thinking about the ships. She was thinking about the missiles themselves. She accessed the fleet's electronic warfare suite, not to jam the incoming threats, but to subtly alter the atmospheric data being fed to their guidance systems. She didn't try to stop them. She lied to them. She told them the air was thicker than it was, that the gravitational pull was slightly different. Tiny, almost imperceptible adjustments that, over the course of a Mach 10 trajectory, would cause them to miss their targets not by feet, but by miles. On the main screen, the terrifying red streaks began to deviate, their perfect arcs bending ever so slightly, sending them plunging harmlessly into the digital ocean. The room fell silent. The panicked shouts ceased. The frantic typing stopped. Every single person in the Fleet Command Operations Center, from the junior ensigns to the decorated captains, turned their heads and stared at the quiet woman at the secondary console. They watched as she manipulated the battle space with the effortless grace of a grandmaster playing 100 games of chess at once. She found the ghost submarines, not by chasing them with torpedoes, but by triangulating their positions based on the minute gravitational distortions their silent drives created in the water, a theoretical detection method that was still years away from practical application. She didn't just find them. She used their own stealth against them, turning their active cloaking systems into passive beacons that lit them up for the fleet's hunter-killer assets. The tide of red on the holographic map didn't just stop. It evaporated. It was routed, dismantled, and utterly defeated. The entire, overwhelming, unwinnable assault was neutralized in 47 seconds from the moment her fingers touched the keyboard. A single word, stark and green, flashed onto the main screen, replacing the chaos of moments before. Victory. For a long moment, the only sound was the gentle hum of the servers, now returned to their placid rhythm. The silence in the room was no longer awkward or tense. It was a deep, profound, and deafening silence of pure, unadulterated awe. Rear Admiral Thorne stood like a statue, his face a canvas of disbelief. His jaw was slack, his eyes wide, fixed on the impossible outcome displayed before him. "No," he whispered, the sound barely audible. That's not possible." He turned his head slowly, mechanically, to look at the woman he had dismissed as a coffee-fetching technician. She was leaning back in her chair now, her hands resting in her lap. Her breathing was even, her expression placid. She looked as if she had just finished a particularly tedious piece of data entry. She had not broken a sweat. She had not uttered a single word. She had simply performed a miracle of tactical and technical brilliance, and in doing so, had shattered the Admiral's entire conception of warfare, competence, and respect. He had demanded a professional, and the universe, in its infinite irony, had delivered one in a form he was utterly incapable of recognizing. The spell of stunned silence was finally broken by the sound of slow, measured footsteps. Fleet Admiral Jonathan Cole emerged from the shadows of the observation deck, stepping onto the main command floor. His face, a roadmap of a long and distinguished career, was set in a stern, unreadable expression. He walked past the frozen form of Rear Admiral Thorne without a glance, his eyes fixed solely on the woman in the gray flight suit. The room held its collective breath. Cole was a living legend, a man who had commanded fleets in 2 wars, a strategic thinker whose opinions shaped global naval policy. His presence on the command deck was an event in itself. For him to intervene personally was unprecedented. He stopped directly in front of her console, his gaze sweeping over the lines of code she had written, the ghost network she had built, the impossible solutions she had engineered. He looked not with confusion, but with a dawning, profound sense of recognition. He turned to his aide, a young captain who was scrambling to keep up. "Captain," Cole's voice was quiet, yet it carried the weight of absolute authority, cutting through the residual shock in the room. "Bring up this officer's service record. Put it on the main screen. All of it." A murmur of confusion rippled through the assembled officers. Thorne finally seemed to snap out of his stupor. "Admiral Cole, with all due respect, this is a classified drill. I'm not sure who this person is, but her access to this console was unauthorized. I'm aware of the classification." "Marcus," Cole said, his voice dropping a full octave, laced with a steel that made Thorne physically recoil. "And I gave the authorization. Now, give me that file." The captain, looking pale, typed furiously at a nearby terminal. A moment later, the green victory sign on the main holographic display was replaced by a standard naval personnel file. The portrait was of the woman seated before them, her expression as neutral and calm in the photo as it was in person. The name read, Hayes Evelyn. Rank, Lieutenant Commander. And then, the room fell silent once more as the rest of the information began to scroll into view, each line landing with the force of a physical blow. Unit, Naval Warfare Development Group, Special Projects Division. A notoriously secretive command, the fabled skunk works of the Navy, where the next century's wars were being imagined and rehearsed. Project designation, Chimera. Even Thorne had only heard rumors of Chimera, a clandestine initiative to develop revolutionary new doctrines for multi-domain warfare, using a blend of artificial intelligence and unconventional human strategy. It was the Navy's secret weapon in the new Cold War of information and technology. But it was the next two lines that sucked the air from the room. Current billet, lead architect, Red Cell Operations. And directly beneath it, in stark, unambiguous lettering, Task Force Chief. She wasn't a player in the simulation. She wasn't a technician. She wasn't even just an observer. She was the one who had designed the entire unwinnable scenario. She was the ghost in the machine. She was the architect of their failure and the author of her own silent victory. The list of her accomplishments continued to scroll. Thousands of simulated combat hours. The Navy Cross for actions during a classified cyber warfare engagement. The Legion of Merit for developing the very predictive threat analysis software that the fleet was now struggling to implement. Mission classifications. Top secret // SCI / covert lattice. This wasn't just a brilliant officer. This was one of the most important strategic minds in the entire United States Navy, hidden in plain sight, camouflaged by her own quiet humility and the loud, blinding arrogance of others. When the file finished scrolling, leaving her title of Task Force Chief glowing in the center of the screen, Fleet Admiral Cole took one step forward, drew himself up to his full height, and executed the sharpest, most formal salute of his career. It was a gesture of profound, almost reverent respect, an old lion acknowledging a new, and perhaps even greater, predator. "Commander Hayes," he said, his voice resonating with authority and something else, sincere apology. "On behalf of my command, I apologize for the unprofessional reception you received from Admiral Thorne. Your work today has been illuminating." Evelyn Hayes finally looked up, her gaze meeting Cole's. She offered no smile, no sign of triumph, only a simple, professional acknowledgement. She returned the salute with crisp, economic precision. "Thank you, Admiral Cole," she said, her voice calm and even. It was the first time she had spoken. "The data is what matters." The system revealed a critical vulnerability in command-level situational awareness under cognitive saturation. "We now have a baseline to correct it." She spoke not of her victory, nor the insult. She spoke only of the mission, the data, the work. For her, it was never personal. It was simply a problem to be solved, a flaw in the system to be exposed and fixed. Rear Admiral Thorne stood by, his face ashen. He had not just made a mistake. He had committed an act of profound institutional ignorance. He had looked at one of the Navy's most vital assets and seen a non-entity. He had insulted the very architect of the test he was failing. The humiliation was absolute, not because he had been defeated by the simulation, but because he had been so utterly blind to the reality standing right in front of him. The lesson was brutal and clear. In the new age of warfare, the greatest threats and the greatest talents might not be the ones that announced themselves with noise and fury, but the ones that operated in the quiet, deadly spaces in between. The legend of what happened in the Fleet Command Operations Center that day spread not like wildfire, but like a ghost signal. A whispered bit of code passed through secure back channels and encrypted messages before it finally broke into the open air of wardroom gossip and hangar deck scuttlebutt. It became known as the Chimera Event, or, more simply, Hayes' Gambit. The story was told and retold, each telling adding another layer of myth to the quiet commander. They said she never touched her controls until the fleet's life support systems were flatlining. They said the code she wrote was so advanced, so elegant, that analysts at the Naval Cyber Warfare Command were still trying to deconstruct it weeks later, treating it like a piece of alien technology. They said that when Fleet Admiral Cole saluted her, every other officer in the room, including the disgraced Thorne, had instinctively snapped to attention and followed suit, a silent, spontaneous tribute to the quiet master who had humbled them all. The story served as a powerful corrective, a modern naval parable for an age of unseen threats and unheralded heroes. It became a cautionary tale about the mortal danger of assumptions, a reminder that the most lethal weapon in any arsenal is the well-trained, disciplined mind, regardless of the rank or appearance of the person who possessed it. Rear Admiral Thorne was not formally reprimanded, which was perhaps the most painful outcome for a man of his pride. He was forced to live with the public knowledge of his failure. But the event changed him. The brittle shell of his arrogance had been shattered, and what lay beneath was a career officer who, beneath it all, still loved the Navy and its mission. A week after the simulation, he appeared at the entrance to the nondescript building that housed the Naval Warfare Development Group. He requested, formally and through proper channels, a one-on-one debriefing with Lieutenant Commander Hayes. When he was shown into her office, a sparse, functional space dominated by a massive, multi-screen workstation, he found her exactly as she had been in the command center, calm, focused, and professional. He didn't offer a flowery, groveling apology. He knew it would be meaningless to her. Instead, he stood at attention, a decorated admiral before a lieutenant commander, and said, "Commander, I failed your test. I would like you to teach me why." It was the most honest and humble act of his career. Evelyn Hayes looked up from her screen, her expression giving nothing away. She simply nodded. "Of course, Admiral," she replied, her voice even. "The data is what matters. Let's begin with the initial threat assessment protocols." She turned her monitor towards him, and the lesson began. She showed him how his textbook responses had played directly into the simulation's hands, how his reliance on traditional command hierarchy created fatal delays in a battle space that operated at the speed of light. She was not a gloating victor. She was a clinical, precise instructor dissecting the failure to find the lesson within. She treated his ignorance not as a personal flaw, but as a systemic vulnerability that needed to be patched. Her humility was more profound than his humiliation. She sought no credit, only correction. She desired no apology, only adaptation. While the story of her triumph became legend, she remained focused on the work. Young ensigns and junior officers who were assigned to her project group would arrive expecting a fire-breathing warrior, a tactical genius surrounded by an aura of mystique. They found instead a quiet, patient mentor who would listen more than she spoke, who taught them to question every assumption, and who instilled in them the core principle of her philosophy. Competence is quiet. Let your results be the noise. The symbolic artifact of the day wasn't a plaque or a trophy. It was a single save data file, the 47-second recording of her keyboard inputs during the simulation. It became a mandatory part of the curriculum at the Naval War College in Newport. Senior officers, the future admirals of the fleet, were required to watch it, to study the impossible efficiency of her actions, and to absorb the lesson embedded within the silent dance of her fingers across the keys. The file was named, simply, Thorn_vulnerability_fix. It was a final, quiet testament to her true purpose. Not to defeat an opponent, but to strengthen the fleet. She had humbled an admiral not to break him, but to rebuild him and the Navy into something stronger, smarter, and more prepared for the silent, unseen wars of the future. The ripple effects of Hayes' Gambit continued to expand, transforming not just doctrine, but the very culture of naval command. A year after the simulation, the changes were palpable. The rigid, top-down command structure that had been exposed as so brittle was being replaced by a more fluid, decentralized model inspired by the ad hoc network Hayes had created in seconds. New training programs, designed by Hayes and her team at Project Chimera, were rolled out across the fleet. They were brutal, complex, and filled with the kind of asymmetric, unwinnable scenarios she had perfected. But this time, commanders were being taught not just to fight, but to think, to adapt, and to listen to the quietest voice in the room, recognizing that it might just be the most important. Rear Admiral Thorn, once a bastion of old-world tradition, became the most vocal and passionate champion of the new methods. He spoke at the Naval War College, not of his victories, but of his single, most profound failure. He used his own story as a teaching tool, a blunt instrument to hammer home the lesson about the danger of prejudice and the critical importance of recognizing competence in all its forms. He never lost his booming voice, but it was now tempered with a humility and wisdom that had been absent before. He spoke of Lieutenant Commander Hayes not as a subordinate, but with the reverence usually reserved for historical figures like Nelson or Nimitz, casting her as a pioneer of a new type of warfare. The story itself became a piece of institutional folklore, a foundational myth for the new generation of naval officers. At Officer Candidate School, instructors would tell the tale to break down the ingrained prejudices of their new charges. Look around you, they would say. The person sitting next to you might not look like your idea of a warrior. They might be quiet. They might be unassuming. But they may well be the one who saves you all one day. Your job is not to judge them by their bearing, but to recognize their competence. Remember Hayes. Remember the Chimera. The legend was a constant reminder that the nature of strength had changed. The measure of a warrior was no longer just their physical courage or their tactical aggression, but their intellectual agility, their technical mastery, and their capacity for calm, clear thought under unimaginable pressure. The era of the loud, swaggering hero was giving way to the age of the quiet professional. Evelyn Hayes herself, of course, remained far from the spotlight she had inadvertently created. She was promoted, naturally, but she turned down multiple offers for high-profile command positions, choosing to remain in the shadows of the Naval Warfare Development Group. For her, the real work, the important work, was not in leading fleets, but in designing the future, in building the systems and strategies that would keep those fleets safe. Her legacy was not written in the bold headlines of naval journals, but in the silent, invisible lines of code that now formed the backbone of the fleet's defense systems. It was present in the newfound confidence of young officers who felt empowered to speak up, their ideas judged on merit, not rank. It was in the quiet respect that now permeated command centers, where assumptions were challenged as a matter of protocol and quiet competence was the most sought-after currency. True legacy, the story of Evelyn Hayes taught the Navy, isn't a monument you build to yourself. It is not found in the medals on your chest or the rank on your collar. It is the foundation you lay for those who come after. It is the quiet, persistent, and often thankless work of making the entire system stronger, smarter, and more resilient. It is the understanding that the ultimate victory is not in winning a single battle, but in changing the way the war is fought, ensuring that the next generation is better prepared, better equipped, and better led than the last. Her silence had been mistaken for absence, but it was, in fact, the deepest form of presence. The presence of a mind so completely engaged with the problem at hand that it had no need for the distracting noise of ego or applause. She had proven that respect is not something you can demand with a loud voice. It is something you command with quiet, undeniable, and irrefutable competence. For more stories where precision triumphs over prejudice and where quiet competence defines true worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.